The handcuffs clicked around his wrists in front of 400 people, and she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable one, a real, full laugh. Like he was the punchline to a joke only she understood. He didn't fight it, didn't raise his voice, just looked at her calmly and said, "I need to make one phone call." She let him. Because she thought he was nobody. She was wrong. Within 72 hours, that single phone call would freeze billions of dollars, trigger a federal investigation, and begin the quiet, methodical collapse of everything Vanessa Ashford had ever built. If this story already has your attention, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Stories like this one, where ordinary people stand up against impossible power, are what this channel is built on. And while you're watching, drop a comment below and tell me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Mason Brooks woke up at 5:15 that morning, the same way he'd woken up every morning for the past 3 years, to the sound of his daughter talking in her sleep. He lay still for a moment, listening through the thin wall between their bedrooms. Couldn't make out the words, never could. But the rhythm of her voice was enough. Just knowing she was there, under that roof, breathing and dreaming and safe, that was the first thing he checked every single day before he checked anything else. He got up slowly. His back had been giving him trouble since the previous winter, when he'd spent 6 weeks hunched over a workbench helping a neighbor restore a drainage system that the county had simply stopped maintaining. Nobody paid him for that. He hadn't expected them to. The kitchen was small. The linoleum near the sink had started to peel at one corner, and Mason had been meaning to fix it for 2 months. He put a pot of coffee on, pulled on his work jacket, a dark green canvas thing with a frayed left cuff and a small bleach stain near the collar that he'd never quite gotten out, and sat at the table with a folder of documents that he'd been carrying with him for 11 days. He didn't open the folder right away. He just looked at it. Inside that folder was evidence, real, specific, technical evidence that a construction project called the Caldwell Tower Development, a 40-story mixed-use building going up on the west edge of the city, had structural problems that weren't showing up in any public report. Problems that, if left unaddressed, could get people killed. Not might. Could. There was a difference, and Mason understood it better than most. He had spent 9 years as a federal safety investigator before his wife got sick. He'd walked collapse sites. He'd written reports that shut down projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He'd testified in front of oversight committees. He knew what a falsified inspection report looked like, and he knew what it felt like to hold one in your hands and understand exactly what the numbers meant and what they were hiding. The man who had given him the folder was named Gerald Fitch, 71 years old, had been a structural welder for 43 years, mostly bridges and commercial high-rises. Fitch didn't have a lawyer. He barely had a computer. What he had was 43 years of experience telling him that something was wrong, and a paper trail, faded, partial, but real, proving that at least 3 load-bearing assessments at the Caldwell site had been altered before they were filed. Mason had met Fitch through a mutual friend 8 months earlier. They'd talked at a community meeting about noise ordinances near the construction site. Fitch had pulled him aside afterward, and they'd stood in the parking lot for almost 2 hours while the old man showed him photographs on a flip phone with a cracked screen. It had taken Mason 6 weeks to verify what Fitch was claiming. He wasn't an investigator anymore. He worked logistics for a regional hardware supply company, managed delivery schedules, handled vendor disputes, answered emails about missing shipments. He used his lunch breaks and his weekends. He cross-referenced the documents Fitch gave him against publicly available engineering specifications. He reached out quietly to a former colleague who still worked in the federal system and who owed him a favor from years back. The answer he got back was simple and brutal. This is real. This needs to go somewhere official. The problem was where. Caldwell Tower was being developed by Ashford Capital Group, which was owned by a woman named Vanessa Ashford. Mason had looked her up after the first conversation with Fitch. She was 30 years old, had taken over the company from her father at 26, and in 4 years had turned a mid-sized real estate development firm into a billion-dollar operation. Business magazines had run profiles on her. There were photos of her at charity galas, at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, shaking hands with the governor. She was by every public measure a success story. The Caldwell project was the biggest thing her company had ever attempted. 40 stories. Mixed commercial and residential. a projected 2,000 workers on site once construction reached full capacity, with another 3,000 people eventually living and working in the building. The financing, somewhere north of $800 million, involved three major investment groups and had been arranged over 18 months of negotiations. Mason had read all of it. Then he'd driven to her headquarters. The Ashford Capital Group building sat at the corner of Meridian and Fifth, in the part of downtown where the glass was always clean and the sidewalks never had cracks. It was a 12-story building with a marble lobby and security badges and a reception desk that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never worked a day at a reception desk in their life. Mason parked 3 blocks away because the parking garage attached to the building charged $9 for the first 30 minutes, and he wasn't going to pay $9 for the privilege of walking into a place where he was trying to do them a favor. He walked the 3 blocks with the folder tucked under his arm. He was wearing his work jacket, the one with the frayed cuff. He'd considered changing. He had a button-down shirt he kept for interviews and court dates, pressed and hanging in the back of his closet. But then he'd thought, why? The documents were the same documents regardless of what he was wearing. The evidence was the evidence. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there to file a disclosure. The lobby was busy. It was a Thursday morning, just after 9, and people were moving in and out with the purposeful speed of people who had somewhere important to be and needed everyone around them to understand that. Mason walked to the reception desk and waited while the woman behind it finished a phone call. "Can I help you?" she said when she hung up. "I need to speak with someone in compliance or risk management," Mason said, "or legal, whichever is most appropriate. I have safety documentation related to the Caldwell Tower project that needs to be formally received." The receptionist looked at him for a moment. Not a mean look, more like the look of someone trying to categorize something that didn't fit neatly into any of the categories they'd been trained to recognize. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, this is a disclosure submission. I'm not sure appointments are the standard process for—" "I'll need to check with someone," she said. "Can I have your name?" "Mason Brooks." She typed something, picked up the phone. He waited, standing with his hands loose at his sides, the folder under his arm. Around him, people with lanyards and laptops moved past without looking at him. After a few minutes, the receptionist looked up. "Someone will come down to meet you shortly. You can wait over there." She gestured toward a cluster of chairs near the far wall. Mason sat down. He looked at the folder. He looked at the people walking through the lobby. He thought about Fitch, who was probably sitting in his apartment at that moment, watching the news with the sound too loud the way he always did, waiting for a phone call. He waited for 34 minutes. The man who eventually came down to meet him wasn't from compliance or risk management or legal. He was a young guy, mid-20s, sharp suit, the kind of haircut that requires a maintenance schedule, who introduced himself as Derek Solt, executive coordinator to Ms. Ashford. "Mr. Brooks?" Derek said, extending a hand with the practiced energy of someone who'd been trained to appear enthusiastic regardless of circumstances. "That's right." Mason shook his hand. "I understand you have some documents you'd like to submit?" "I do. They relate to structural safety concerns at the Caldwell Tower project. I'd like to submit them formally through whatever intake process your compliance team uses for third-party disclosures." Derek's smile didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. "Can I ask how you came by this documentation?" "I'd prefer to discuss that with someone in a legal or compliance capacity," Mason said. Of course, of course." Derek nodded in a way that suggested he was agreeing without committing to anything. "Why don't you come up? Ms. Ashford is actually available for just a few minutes, and she's expressed interest in meeting with you personally." Mason hesitated. He hadn't expected that. "Ms. Ashford specifically?" "She likes to be personally involved when external parties bring concerns to the company's attention," Derek said. "Part of her management philosophy." Mason looked at him for a moment. He thought about the best way to handle this, whether a meeting with the CEO was the appropriate channel for a formal disclosure, whether it would actually help, or whether it would muddy things. But he thought about Fitch, and he thought about 5,000 people who were eventually going to live and work in a building he now had specific reason to believe might not be safe. "All right," he said. The elevator was fast and silent. 32nd floor. The doors opened onto a hallway that was quieter than the lobby, but somehow louder in the ways that mattered. The kind of quiet that made noise with its own weight. Derek walked him through two sets of glass doors and into a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. The table was long enough to seat 20. There were 8 or 10 people already in the room, some standing, some seated, some with laptops open. An informal meeting of some kind that had apparently already been underway. And at the far end of the table, standing with one hand resting on the back of a chair and a phone in the other, was Vanessa Ashford. She was exactly what the photograph suggested, compact and composed, with the kind of energy that filled a room without making any visible effort to do so. Dark blazer, dark hair pulled back, eyes that moved quickly and assessed without appearing to assess. She looked like she slept 5 hours a night by choice and had never once regretted it. She glanced at Mason when he entered, then at Derek, then back at Mason. Her eyes moved once, quickly, from his face to his jacket to the folder under his arm and back to his face. It was the kind of look that takes a fraction of a second and covers a lot of ground. "Mr. Brooks," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just a statement of fact. "Ms. Ashford." Mason nodded. "I appreciate you making time. I'll keep this straightforward. I have documentation of what I believe to be materially altered structural assessments related to your Caldwell Tower project. I'm here to submit that documentation formally. I'd like confirmation of receipt from someone with legal authority to accept it." There was a brief pause in the room. Not silence. A few people were still typing. Someone was whispering near the window. But a pause in whatever energy had been occupying the space a moment ago. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Where did you get this documentation?" "From a source I believe to be credible," Mason said. "I'd rather discuss the specifics with your legal or compliance team." "And who are you exactly?" she said. "What do you do?" "I used to be a federal safety investigator. Currently I work in logistics for a hardware supply company." Something moved across her face. Hard to name exactly. Not quite amusement and not quite contempt, but somewhere in the neighborhood of both. "Logistics," she repeated. "Yes." She looked at the folder under his arm. Then she looked back at his face, and this time the assessment lasted a little longer, and when it was finished, something in her expression had settled into a decision. "Let me be very direct with you, Mr. Brooks," she said, and the room got quieter. "We receive inquiries like this regularly. People who have found something online or heard something from someone or just decided that a project of this scale must have something worth finding. And what they usually want, what they almost always want, is money. A settlement, a payment, some form of compensation to make the concern go away." She paused. "Is that what we're doing here?" Mason looked at her steadily. "No." "No?" She made a small gesture, not quite a shrug. "Because the jacket tells a story, Mr. Brooks. The folder. The no appointment. The claim that you used to be someone important, and now you are—" She gestured briefly at all of him. It's a recognizable pattern. With respect," Mason said quietly, "I'd ask you to look at the documents." "I'm sure they're very persuasive," she said. And then something shifted. A loosening around the edges of her control, the first genuine emotion she'd shown since he walked in. And she laughed. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was the laugh of someone who believed they were the smartest person in the room and had just received confirmation of that belief. Around the table, a few people smiled. Someone near the window looked down. Derek Solt studied his shoes. "Ms. Ashford," Mason said. He kept his voice flat. "I'm asking you, as clearly as I can, to accept this disclosure properly. Through your legal team, with written confirmation of receipt. That's all I'm asking." "And I'm telling you," she said, "as clearly as I can that this isn't how we do things here. Derek, I also want to be clear," Mason said, still quiet, "that if you decline to receive this through proper channels today, I have other options for how to file it. I'd prefer to start here. I'd prefer to give your company the opportunity to address this internally." "Derek," Vanessa continued, without acknowledging what he'd said, "please have security escort Mr. Brooks out. And if he left a vehicle in our parking structure, see to it that it's ticketed." "I wasn't in your parking structure," Mason said. "Then see to it that security processes him appropriately," she said, and turned back to her phone. What happened next took about 4 minutes. 2 security officers arrived. Not the lobby kind, but the contracted kind. Bigger and with the specific expression of people whose job requires them to leave their opinions at the door. They asked Mason to come with them. He said yes. He didn't argue, didn't stiffen, didn't raise his voice. He just stood up from the chair someone had gestured him toward and walked with them toward the elevator. What he didn't know, what none of them knew until later, was that someone on the floor had already called the police. Not because Mason had done anything threatening, but because somewhere in the decision chain that Vanessa Ashford managed, someone had decided that formal meant maximum, that escorting someone out meant doing it with the full weight of whatever force was available. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, there were 2 police officers waiting. The lobby was full. Morning rush was still going, people coming in for meetings, delivery workers, a group of what looked like interns moving in a cluster near the coffee kiosk that operated out of a cart near the east entrance. Maybe 400 people in the broad lobby space and the atrium above it. Mason came out of the elevator with the 2 security officers and stopped when he saw the police. "Sir," one of the officers said, "we need to ask you a few questions." "All right," Mason said. "Did you threaten anyone on the 30th floor?" "No." "There's been a complaint filed." "I understand. I'd like to see the specifics of that complaint." He paused. "I'd also like to make one phone call before anything else happens." The officer looked at him. "We're just asking some questions at this point." "I know, and I'm going to cooperate fully. I just need to make one call." But the sequence of events had already been set in motion by someone up on the 30th floor who had made their own calls, and the momentum of that sequence was faster than the conversation in the lobby. One of the security officers said something into a radio, and 30 seconds later, Vanessa Ashford herself appeared at the lobby's second-floor railing, the interior balcony that overlooked the atrium, with Derek Solt just behind her and several other people from the conference room behind him. She looked down at Mason, and she did it in front of everyone, all 400 of them. "Process him," she said to the officers below, loud enough to carry, loud enough to make sure the lobby understood who was making this decision and why. The handcuffs clicked around Mason's wrists. He stood still. He didn't fight it. He looked up at her on the balcony above him, at her clean blazer and her certainty and her performance. And he said, in a voice that was quiet but somehow carried anyway, "I need to make one phone call." She laughed again. Up there on the balcony, with her hand on the railing and 400 people watching, it was a real laugh, a confident one, the laugh of someone who genuinely believed they had won. And then the officers allowed him his call because he'd asked calmly and correctly, and he dialed a number from memory. No hesitation, no searching his contacts, and waited. The person on the other end picked up on the second ring. "Ev," Mason said quietly, "it's Mason. I need to activate the disclosure. Document package is in my pocket. I'm currently in custody at the Ashford Capitol Building, Meridian and Fifth. Fifth, yes, the Caldwell Project, all of it." He listened for a moment. "I know, thank you." He hung up. The officer took the phone back. The security team moved him toward the door. Someone in the lobby had been filming on their phone since the moment the handcuffs appeared. Not because they knew what was happening, just because handcuffs in a corporate lobby were something you filmed. The video was 43 seconds long. It showed the handcuffs going on. It showed Mason standing still and dignified and small in his frayed jacket. It showed the woman on the balcony laughing. And it showed, in the last 8 seconds before the camera was jostled and the shot broke up, Mason Brooks looking up at Vanessa Ashford with an expression that was not angry and not afraid. Just quiet. And completely certain. His daughter's name was Lily, and she was 13 and she was doing homework at the kitchen table when the video reached her school's group chat at 4:17 in the afternoon. She recognized the jacket first, the green canvas jacket with the frayed cuff. She'd been trying to get her dad to replace it for 2 years. She watched the video 3 times. When Mason walked in at 6:30, they'd held him for 4 hours, no charges filed, standard intake processing. Lily was still at the kitchen table. The homework was still open, but she'd stopped doing it somewhere around page 2 of the reading. She looked at him when he came through the door. He looked at her. "I saw the video," she said. "Yeah." He set his keys on the counter. "I figured you might. Are you okay?" He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He looked tired. Not beaten, just tired. The specific tiredness of someone who has been on high alert for hours and is only now allowing their body to notice it. "I'm okay, Lily. They put handcuffs on you." "They did." And she laughed. Lily's voice stayed flat, but her jaw was tight. "That woman on the balcony, she laughed at you." Mason looked at the table for a moment, then back at his daughter. She did. Why didn't you say something? You just stood there. There wasn't anything to say. He folded his hands on the table. Sometimes the best thing you can do in a moment like that is let it happen. Let people see exactly what's happening without you adding noise to it. The noise only covers things up. Lily thought about that. She was a kid who thought about things. Had been since she was small. Not a serious kid, not a quiet one exactly, but one who took time before she responded to things. Her mother had been the same way. Mason had loved that about her mother. He loved it about Lily too, even when it drove him up the wall. "What did you do?" she finally said. "When they let you call someone." "I called Evelyn Ross, you remember her? The one from your old job. She came to Mom's." Lily stopped. "Yeah, I remember her. She's going to make sure the documents go where they need to go, officially, through the right channels." And then what? Mason looked at his daughter, at the dark circles she was starting to get from staying up too late reading, at the way she'd started chewing the end of her pencil again when she was worried, a habit she'd supposedly broken in 4th grade. "Then we wait," he said, "and we trust the process." "The process didn't look great today, Dad." "No," he said, "it didn't. But that's the thing about processes. They're not always pretty in the moment." He paused. "The woman who laughed at me today has no idea what she just started." Lily studied him for a long moment. "Were you scared?" she asked. "In the lobby." Mason was quiet for a second. He'd always told his daughter the truth, even when it was complicated. Her mother had insisted on it. "Don't protect her from reality," she told him once. "Protect her for it." "Yeah," he said. "A little. Not about the handcuffs. About whether I'd gotten it right. Whether I'd done enough to protect the disclosure before they arrested me. Whether calling Ev was going to be enough." He paused. "That's the part that had me scared." "But you still did it." "Yeah. Even knowing she was going to—" Lily gestured vaguely. "Do all of that." "Especially then," Mason said. Lily looked at her homework, then at her dad, then at the kitchen wall where her mother's photo still hung, 3 years now, and Mason hadn't moved it, and Lily had never asked him to. "Okay," she said finally. That was all. Just okay. She went back to her homework. Mason got up and started making dinner. Pasta. Because it was fast, and he hadn't thought about food all day, and his body was running on coffee and adrenaline and whatever you had left when both of those burned out. The kitchen smelled like garlic after a few minutes. Outside, without either of them knowing it, the video kept spreading. And in a federal building 40 minutes across the city, a woman named Evelyn Ross sat at her desk with a phone call log in front of her and a case file she hadn't looked at in 18 months, and she picked up her own phone, and she began to make calls. Quiet calls. Careful calls. The kind that didn't make noise in the moment, but whose echoes would be heard, in boardrooms and law offices and investment group headquarters, for a very long time. Mason Brooks ate pasta with his daughter and washed the dishes and didn't check his phone once. He'd done the part he could do. The rest wasn't in his hands. It never really was. The video hit 200,000 views before midnight. Evelyn Ross knew this because her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since 9 in the evening, and the calls weren't from friends. They were from people she hadn't heard from in years. Former colleagues, a retired federal compliance officer she'd worked with on a pipeline case back in 2019, a journalist she'd spoken to once at a conference and never again. All of them had seen the same 43 seconds. All of them were asking the same question. Is that Mason Brooks? She didn't answer any of those calls. She was busy. Her office was small. She'd kept it that way deliberately, a habit from her years in the field when the investigators who had the biggest offices were always the ones who spent the least time actually investigating. A desk, 2 file cabinets, a whiteboard she'd had since the Clinton administration, and a window that looked out onto a parking structure. Not glamorous, functional. She was 61 years old, had been doing this work in one form or another for over 30 years, and had long since stopped caring what her office said about her. What she cared about, at 11:43 on a Thursday night, was the case file she'd pulled from her secondary archive cabinet, the one where she kept matters that had been formally closed, but that she'd never quite been able to stop thinking about. The Caldwell file. She'd opened it 18 months ago, briefly, when a different source had raised different concerns about the same project. That source had disappeared, not literally, but in the way sources sometimes disappeared when the money on the other side of a complaint was large enough. Stopped returning calls. Moved. The case had gone cold before it had really started. But Mason Brooks wasn't the kind of man who disappeared. She'd known him for 11 years, had recruited him out of a university engineering program when he was 23, trained him herself over a 2-year period, and watched him become one of the sharpest investigators she'd ever worked with. Not the loudest, not the most ambitious, but the most thorough. The kind of investigator who didn't file a report until he was certain, absolutely certain, that every number he was citing could withstand the hardest possible scrutiny. When his wife got sick, he'd stepped away from the work. Evelyn hadn't tried to pull him back. Some things mattered more than the job. But she'd always known that if Mason Brooks called her about something, it was real. She opened the folder he'd sent through the emergency disclosure protocol, the digital package that had been automatically routed to her secure server the moment he'd confirmed his identity over the phone. 47 pages. She started at the beginning and didn't stop. By 2 in the morning, she had filled half the whiteboard. By 3, she was on the phone with a federal oversight coordinator named Philip Chandra, who was not happy about being called at 3 in the morning, but who was also, once he understood what she was telling him, no longer thinking about sleep. "How solid is the sourcing?" he asked. "The original source is a 43-year veteran welder named Gerald Fitch," Evelyn said. "He has the original documents, pre-alteration. Mason has the filed versions. Side by side, you can see exactly where the numbers were changed and what they were changed to." "Changed how?" "Load tolerance figures on 4 of the primary support columns, reduced by between 12 and 18% in the filed versions compared to the engineering originals. Someone went through and made them look compliant, but they didn't have the original engineer's notes, which Fitch had photographed on site before the documents were pulled." There was a silence on the line. "Philip," Evelyn said, "the building is at 60% construction. They're scheduled to begin full workforce operations in 11 weeks. Another silence. Longer. "I'll make the calls," he said. She hung up and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the parking structure and the dark sky above it. Somewhere across the city, Mason Brooks was probably asleep, or trying to be. She hoped he'd eaten something. She went back to the whiteboard. There was still a lot of work to do before morning. The first investor notification went out at 6:15 the following morning. Evelyn didn't send it. That wasn't her role. It came from the Federal Oversight Office, a formal communication routed through the Regulatory Compliance Channel that every major investment group participating in the Caldwell financing was contractually required to monitor. The language was precise and carefully calibrated, the kind of language that said everything it needed to say without saying anything that could be later characterized as premature. It said, in essence, a formal safety disclosure has been filed regarding the Caldwell Tower development project. All financing parties are advised to suspend active disbursements pending regulatory review. The Halcourt Investment Group received the notification at 6:15. By 6:40, their legal team had already been on the phone with their risk management division for 20 minutes. By 7:10, Halcourt had sent its own internal notice suspending $340 million in scheduled disbursements. The second investment group, Meridian Capital Partners, received the same federal notification and had suspended their portion, $260 million, by 7:30. The third group took until 8:15 because their compliance director was traveling and had to be reached by cell phone in an airport in Phoenix. But the suspension came. $820 million. Frozen. The Caldwell construction site went quiet at 10:47 that morning when the on-site project manager received a call from Ashford Capital's own legal team instructing him to halt all non-essential operations pending an urgent internal review. The construction workers didn't know why. They sat in their trucks and drank coffee, and some of them called home to say they might be back early. Gerald Fitch found out through a news alert on his phone. He was sitting in his apartment, the TV loud the way it always was, and the alert popped up. Caldwell Tower project halts operations amid regulatory review. He read it twice. Then he set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat very still for a long time. He'd been carrying what he knew for 16 months. When his hands finally stopped shaking, he picked the phone back up and called Mason. Mason was at work, or trying to be. He'd come in because he didn't know what else to do with himself, because staying home and watching the news felt worse than sitting at his desk and pretending he had a normal Thursday. His manager, a guy named Tim, who wasn't a bad person, but who had the self-preservation instincts of someone who'd been middle management for 20 years, had called him into his office at 9:15 and said, with the careful tone of a man reading from a script he'd written himself, "Mason, given the nature of the public attention around some things, I think it might be better if you took some personal time, paid, just until things settle." Mason had looked at him for a moment. "You're telling me to stay home?" "I'm telling you to take some time," Tim said. "Paid. Because of the video. Because the company has clients who—" Tim stopped. "Look, it's not about you personally, Mason. It's just about the optics of—" "It's fine," Mason said. "I'll take the time." He was in his truck in the parking lot when Fitch called. "It stopped," Fitch said when Mason picked up. His voice was different than usual, looser, like a muscle that had been clenched so long it didn't quite know how to release. "They stopped the site." "I know," Mason said. "I heard." "You did it." Fitch's voice cracked slightly on the last word. Just slightly. "We did it," Mason said. "And it's not over yet, Gerald. The stopping is just the beginning. The hard part is making sure it stays stopped for the right reasons." "You think they'll try to restart it?" "I think they'll try everything," Mason said. "That's what money does when it feels threatened. It moves." He paused. "You doing all right?" "My hands are shaking." "That's probably fine." "How are you so calm?" Fitch asked, and there was something genuine in the question, something past frustrated, a real bafflement, like he was asking about a phenomenon he couldn't explain. "I'm not calm," Mason said. "I'm just doing one thing at a time." He looked through the truck windshield at the gray sky. "Go eat something, Gerald. Drink some water. The next few weeks are going to be long." He sat in the parking lot for another 20 minutes after he hung up, not going anywhere, just sitting. His back hurt. He hadn't slept well. The coffee he'd bought at the gas station on the way in had gone cold. He thought about Lily, who was at school, and who had texted him that morning. "Video is at 800K. Kids at school keep asking me about it. I don't know what to say." He'd written back, "Tell them it's complicated. That's true and it covers most things." He started the truck and drove home. He didn't know, as he drove, that 40 minutes across the city, the 33rd floor of the Ashford Capital Group building had become something close to a controlled emergency. He didn't know that Vanessa Ashford had been in back-to-back calls since 6:30 in the morning. He didn't know that her general counsel, a 60-year-old man named Raymond Oakes, who had been with the company for 6 years and who had seen his share of corporate crises, had walked into her office at 8:50 and closed the door behind him with the specific energy of someone delivering news they genuinely did not want to deliver. "How bad?" Vanessa had asked before he could speak. Raymond sat down, which was itself informative because Raymond Oakes did not usually sit down when he was delivering manageable news. "The federal disclosure is legitimate," he said. "The filing is procedurally airtight. Whoever helped Brooks with this knew exactly what they were doing." Vanessa said nothing. "The investor suspensions are a cascade response to the regulatory notification. We can't legally challenge them. The notification triggered standard protective clauses in all 3 investment agreements." He set a single sheet of paper on the desk. "Effective as of this morning, we have no active financing for Caldwell." She looked at the paper. She didn't pick it up. "What about the construction halt?" "Our legal team ordered it voluntarily to avoid a mandatory federal stop work order, which would have carried additional regulatory weight. Voluntary is better for us in the short term." Raymond paused. "Vanessa, I need to know something, and I need you to answer me directly." She looked at him. "The structural assessment documents that were filed with the Oversight Board for Caldwell, are they accurate?" The room was very quiet. "They went through the standard review process," she said. "That's not what I asked." Vanessa stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the city. Raymond waited. He was good at waiting. "There were discussions," she finally said, "about how certain figures were presented, to make the compliance pathway cleaner." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then, "Vanessa, do you understand what that sentence means in the context of a federal safety investigation?" She didn't answer. "Because what it means," he said, "is that we are no longer in a public relations situation." She turned around. Her face was composed, but her jaw was tight in a way Raymond recognized. He'd seen it twice before, both times in situations that had not ended well. "Fix it," she said. "I can't fix this," Raymond said quietly. "Nobody can fix this. What I can do is manage it, but only if you tell me the truth right now about everything you know." It was the longest conversation they'd ever had. In a different office, in a different part of the city, the investigation was moving with the specific, unhurried efficiency of a process that knew it had time on its side. Evelyn Ross had been joined by 2 federal compliance officers and a structural engineering consultant named Dr. Andrea Voss, who had been pulled in from a university research position and who, within 4 hours of reviewing the comparative documents, had produced a 12-page technical summary that used the word catastrophic 3 times and critical failure risk twice. Dr. Voss was 44, had been studying structural failures for 18 years, and was not given to overstatement. When she set the 12 pages on the conference table and took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, everyone in the room understood that what she was about to say wasn't going to be comfortable. "The filed compliance figures put those 4 support columns within margin," she said. "But the original figures, Fitch's originals, put them outside margin by a significant enough amount that I would not set foot in that building at full occupancy." She picked up one of the documents. "These alterations weren't mistakes. The pattern of changes is too consistent. Someone who understood exactly what they were looking at made deliberate decisions about which numbers to adjust and by how much." "To pass compliance?" Evelyn said. "To pass compliance," Dr. Voss confirmed. "But here's what concerns me even more than the numbers themselves." She laid out 3 photographs. Site photographs, time-stamped, from 6 weeks earlier. "The construction has proceeded based on the filed figures, not the originals, which means the physical structure as it currently exists is built to the fraudulent specifications." The room was quiet for a moment. "What's the failure risk at full occupancy?" Philip Chandra asked. Dr. Voss put her glasses back on. "I'd need a full physical inspection to give you a precise answer, but based on these documents alone, I'd say the risk of progressive structural collapse under full load conditions is high enough that I'd want nobody in that building until we've been through it completely." The stop work formalization went through federal channels that afternoon. It wasn't voluntary anymore. Mason found out about the federal stop work order the same way most people found out about most things. A news notification on his phone while he was standing in his kitchen making a sandwich because he'd realized at 1 o'clock that he hadn't eaten anything since the half a cup of cold gas station coffee. He read the notification twice, set the phone face down on the counter, and finished making the sandwich. He ate it standing at the kitchen window, looking at the backyard. The grass needed cutting. It had needed cutting for 2 weeks, and he kept forgetting to get to it. He'd promised Lily he'd build raised garden beds back there last spring, and he still hadn't done that either. He thought about Fitch's hands shaking on the phone. He thought about Raymond Oakes, whoever that was, sitting across from Vanessa Ashford in some glass-walled office and delivering news that she was not going to want to hear. He thought about the 43-second video and the 2 million views it was apparently sitting at now, according to the last time he'd looked, which had been that morning and which he'd decided was the last time he was going to look, because the number didn't change anything. And it was starting to make him feel strange in a way he didn't have a good word for. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Evelyn. "Hey," he said. "How are you holding up?" She had the voice of someone who'd been awake for 36 hours and was functioning on something past adrenaline, some deeper reserve that people in this kind of work developed over time. "Fine," he said. "Saw the federal order." "It's locked in," she said. "The engineering review starts on Monday. Andrea Voss is leading it. She's the best I know." "What did she say about the documents?" A brief pause. "She said they were deliberately altered by someone who knew what they were doing." "Yeah," Mason said. "I know." "How long did you know?" "That someone had altered them? Since I cross-referenced the originals against the filed versions. 6 weeks ago." He paused. "I wanted to be sure before I moved." "You were sure." "I was sure enough. There's a difference." He ate the last corner of his sandwich. "What about Fitch? Is he protected?" "He's been formally designated as a protected disclosure source. He can't be touched." "He's going to need someone to explain what that means," Mason said. "Legally, in plain language. He doesn't trust lawyers." "I'll call him personally. He'd appreciate that." Mason was quiet for a moment. "Eva, I got let go from work today." She didn't say anything for a second. "Voluntarily?" "Paid personal time that's almost certainly going to convert to something else once the dust settles." He looked at the backyard. It's fine. I've got some savings. Lily is covered for school. Mason, it's fine, he said again. This is how it works. I knew this was how it worked when I made the call. Another brief silence. The disclosure fee structure, as a formal federal whistleblower, Evelyn said carefully. You're aware of... I'm not doing this for the money, Ev. I know that. I'm telling you that you're entitled to it regardless. He didn't answer. Okay, she said. I'll keep you informed as things develop. There's going to be more. A lot more. I know. He looked at the yard again. How's the internal employee side? Anybody starting to talk? That, Evelyn said, is developing faster than I expected, which was the understatement of the month, because what Evelyn hadn't told him yet, what was still emerging, still being confirmed and cross-referenced by her team, was that Mason Brooks and Gerald Fitch were not the only people who had known something was wrong with the Caldwell assessments. Inside Ashford Capital Group, there were others. Had been, for months. A project compliance coordinator named Maria Solis had filed an internal concern report 14 months earlier. The report had been received by her direct manager, who had passed it to a senior director named Carl Whitmore, who had written back to Maria a week later saying that the concern had been reviewed and determined to be within acceptable parameters. Maria had asked to see the review. She'd never received it. She'd followed up twice, been told both times that the matter was closed, and had eventually, not because she stopped believing something was wrong, but because she had a mortgage and a kid, and the specific vulnerability of someone who knows that raising your voice too loudly in the wrong room can cost you everything, stopped asking. She was at her desk when the federal stop work order hit the news. She sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then she opened her bottom desk drawer, pulled out a USB drive she'd kept there for 14 months, and made a call to the number on the federal oversight notification. A compliance coordinator who worked 2 floors below Maria, a young man named Derek. Not Derek Solt. A different Derek. Derek Park, 28 and 2 years into his first post-college job, had discovered 3 months ago that a set of inspection certification emails had been modified before they were forwarded to the regulatory submission team. He hadn't known what to do with that. He told his roommate about it, who told him to either report it or forget it, because sitting in the middle was the worst place to be. He'd been sitting in the middle ever since. He stopped sitting in the middle at 11:47 that Thursday morning. He took screenshots. He emailed them to a personal account. Then he called the same number Maria had called 15 minutes earlier. By the end of the day, Evelyn's team had received 4 separate internal disclosures from Ashford Capital employees. By Friday morning, there were 7. Each one was a thread. Each thread, when pulled, led to the same place. The name that kept appearing across multiple internal email chains and 2 sets of forwarded meeting notes was Carl Whitmore. Whitmore was 53, Senior Director of Project Compliance at Ashford Capital. Had been with the company for 9 years, predating Vanessa's tenure by 3 years. Had built the internal compliance process more or less from the ground up. Every concern that had come in from inside the company, Maria's report, 2 others that the team found evidence of in archived email chains, had passed through his office, and every concern had been marked closed without a documented resolution. That was the thread Evelyn was pulling when she called Mason. That was what was developing faster than she'd expected. On Friday afternoon, a forensic data team authorized by the Federal Oversight Office pulled archived files from Ashford Capital's internal server, a process that the company's legal team challenged and lost in the space of about 90 minutes, because the authorization was airtight and the challengers knew it. Among the archived files were 3 versions of the structural assessment documents, the originals, an intermediate version, and the final filed version. Between the intermediate and final versions, the changes were small, specific, technical, the kind of changes that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for them and who didn't understand structural load engineering. Dr. Voss looked at all 3 versions on Friday evening and said, in the flat, precise voice of someone who had been doing this long enough to have left most of her emotional reactions behind, the person who made these changes understood exactly what they were changing and why. This was not a clerical error. This was not a misunderstanding of the specifications. Whoever did this knew what the real numbers meant and chose to replace them with numbers that would pass. Philip Chandra asked, "Can you tell who made the changes?" The file metadata, said the forensic analyst sitting next to Dr. Voss, shows the final modifications were made from a workstation assigned to Carl Whitmore. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people arrives at the same understanding at the same moment. Mason didn't learn any of this until Saturday morning when Evelyn called him again. He was in the backyard with a cup of coffee that was already going cold. Lily was still asleep. The grass still needed cutting. "Whitmore?" he said. His workstation. His credentials. The timing matches a period when he was alone in the office. Camera footage confirms it. He was there until 11:30 on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks before the compliance submission deadline. Mason processed this. Vanessa didn't know? That's the question, Evelyn said, and it's a harder one to answer. What does the email trail say? We have emails showing that Whitmore sent the compliance team a summary memo the day after the modifications were made. The memo described the assessments as complete and within specification. Vanessa's executive team received that memo. Vanessa is CC'd. CC'd, not addressed. Right. So she may not have read it, Mason said. She may not have read it, Evelyn confirmed. Or she may have read it and trusted the summary without pulling the underlying documents. Or she knew, Mason said. Or she knew, Evelyn said. We don't have evidence of that yet. We're working on it. Mason drank his cold coffee. In the bedroom window above the backyard, the light was on now. Lily was up, probably moving toward the kitchen looking for cereal. What happens to Whitmore? He asked. That's going to be a conversation between federal prosecutors and their case team, Evelyn said. It's not mine to determine. And the building? Physical inspection team goes in Monday morning. Until they've completed the review and filed their report, that site doesn't move. And the workers? The ones who got turned away? Evelyn paused. Their status is complicated right now. Some were direct hires, some were through subcontractors. The company is legally required to maintain their status pending the investigation, but the practical reality of how quickly that gets sorted out. So they're in limbo, Mason said. For now. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. A sparrow landed on the fence at the back of the yard, looked around, left. All right, he said. Mason, Evelyn said, you should know. The story is getting large. Media, the public. The video is at 4.5 million views now, and reporters are going to start looking for you directly. I know. Do you want me to connect you with a media liaison who can... No, he said. I'm not doing press. Mason, I'm not doing press, Ev. This isn't about me. A pause. Okay. Is there anything specific you need from me this weekend? No, rest. Be with your daughter. That's the plan. He looked up at the bedroom window. The light was still on. Thank you, Ev, for moving as fast as you did. You gave me something real to work with, she said. That's the job. He hung up and stood in the yard for another few minutes with the cold coffee and the overgrown grass and the Saturday morning silence that felt different from weekday silence. Heavier, somehow, or maybe just more honest about what it was. Inside, he heard Lily opening the cereal cabinet. Inside a law firm conference room across the city, a team of attorneys hired by Ashford Capital was preparing an approach that would arrive in Mason's life by Monday morning. A settlement offer attached to a non-disclosure agreement, carrying a number with 7 figures that they believed would make most problems go away. They didn't know Mason Brooks. They were about to find out. The settlement offer arrived on a Monday morning, hand-delivered by a courier to Mason's front door at 8:15, in a thick cream-colored envelope with the return address of Harmon, Veld & Associates, one of the 3 largest corporate law firms in the state. Mason was in the middle of making Lily's lunch when the knock came. He answered the door in his work jacket. He'd thrown it on out of habit, force of muscle memory from years of early mornings. And the courier, a young woman with a tablet and a professional neutrality that suggested she'd delivered things like this before, asked him to sign for it. He signed. He took the envelope inside. He set it on the kitchen counter and finished making the sandwich first. What's that? Lily said, appearing from the hallway with her backpack over one shoulder and her hair still half done, which was the standard state of her hair on Monday mornings. Something from lawyers, Mason said. Good lawyers or bad lawyers? Theirs, he said. Lily looked at the envelope for a moment, then at her father. Are you going to open it? After you leave for school. She grabbed the sandwich off the counter. He'd cut it diagonally, which was the only way she'd eat it, a preference established in 2nd grade that had never changed, and went back to finish her hair. Mason poured a second cup of coffee, sat down at the table, and opened the envelope. The cover letter was 4 paragraphs. Professionally written, carefully worded, the kind of language that wrapped a threat in the appearance of generosity. The substance of it was simple. Ashford Capital Group, in the interest of resolving the matter promptly and avoiding prolonged legal proceedings, was prepared to offer Mason Brooks a settlement of $38 million, contingent upon his agreement to the terms outlined in the enclosed non-disclosure agreement, his withdrawal of all formal complaints currently filed with federal oversight bodies, and his public confirmation that the concerns he had raised had been fully addressed to his satisfaction. $38 million. He read the number twice, not because he was tempted, he wasn't, not in the way they were counting on, but because the number itself told him something. You didn't offer $38 million to make a problem go away, unless the problem, if it stayed, was going to cost you significantly more than $38 million. The size of the offer was its own kind of confession. He put the letter back in the envelope. When Lily came back through to leave, she looked at him sitting at the table with the envelope in front of him. "Well?" she said. "Well, what?" "What did it say?" Mason picked up his coffee. "They want to pay me a lot of money to be quiet." Lily stood in the doorway. She was 13 and she had her mother's eyes, and she looked at him the way her mother used to look at him when she wanted to make sure he was saying what he actually meant and not what he thought he was supposed to say. "How much is a lot?" she said. $38 million. The hallway was very quiet for a moment. "Dollars," Lily said. "Dollars." She shifted the backpack on her shoulder. She looked at the envelope. She looked at her father. "What are you going to do?" "What do you think I'm going to do?" She thought about it for about 3 seconds. "Tell them no." "Yeah," Mason said. She nodded once, like that settled it. "I'll be home by 4. She went out the door, and he heard her feet on the porch steps, and then the sound of her walking down the block toward the bus stop. He sat at the table a little longer. Then he called Evelyn. "They sent an offer," he said when she picked up. "We expected this." "How much?" $38 million. A pause. "With NDA and complaint withdrawal?" "Both." "Okay," Evelyn said. "You know what I'm going to say." "Tell me anyway." "The NDA would neutralize your federal disclosure. Legally, withdrawing the complaint doesn't erase the investigation. The federal case exists independently at this point. But it would complicate the evidentiary picture, and it would give their lawyers something to work with in terms of challenging the procedural standing of everything we've built so far." "So the investigation would still proceed," Mason said. "Possibly, probably, but with a harder road." "And the workers, the structural issue?" "The inspection is already underway. Dr. Voss's team has been on site since this morning. That piece is independent enough that it would likely proceed regardless." She paused. "But Mason, the disclosure you filed, the one that started all of this, matters to the criminal side of this case. If you withdraw it—" "I'm not withdrawing it," he said. She let out a breath. Not relief exactly, more like the sound of confirmation. "I need to send them a written response," he said. "Not through you. This is personal. Can you recommend someone for that?" "I know a lawyer," she said. "His name is Patrick Shen. He's good and he's honest, which is a rarer combination than it should be." Mason wrote the name down on the back of a grocery receipt that was on the table. "Thanks." "Mason," she hesitated. "These lawyers, Harmon, Velde, they're not going to accept a simple no. They're going to escalate." "I know." "Escalate meaning they'll start looking at your background, looking for leverage, for anything they can use to discredit you or complicate your position." "I know that too." "Is there anything they can find?" He thought about it honestly, the way a man does when he actually searches his own history instead of just performing the search. "I got a speeding ticket in 2019, he said. "Other than that, no." Evelyn almost laughed. "All right, call Patrick." He called Patrick Shen, who was 60, direct, and who said within the first 4 minutes of their conversation, "The offer is high, which tells you they're scared. Scared money moves fast and it moves sloppily. My advice is to send a 1-page response. Polite, clear, no." "Just no?" Mason said. "Just no," Patrick said. "No counter. No negotiation. No explanation. The moment you explain your reasons, you give them something to argue with. You just say no, and you let them figure out what that means." The response went out that afternoon. 1 paragraph. Mason Brooks declines the settlement offer and all associated terms. He considers the matter fully addressed through the existing federal channels. He wishes Harmon, Velde, and Associates a good day. Patrick had written the last line. Mason had almost cut it, then decided to leave it in. The fallout inside Ashford Capital Group that week was not a single explosion. It was a series of smaller ones, each arriving before the previous had fully settled, in the way that real institutional collapse tends to work. Not the dramatic implosion of movies, but the grinding, relentless sequence of bad news following bad news until the accumulated weight of it became impossible to manage. It started with Carl Whitmore. Whitmore had retained his own attorney by Saturday, a criminal defense lawyer named Bauer, who specialized in white-collar cases and whose first piece of advice had been, reportedly, for his client to stop talking to everyone at Ashford Capital immediately. Whitmore had tried to follow that advice. He'd stopped answering Raymond Oakes's calls on Sunday morning. He'd stopped coming into the office. What he hadn't stopped was existing on a company server, where 3 years of emails under his name sat in archived folders that the federal forensic team was working through with patient, methodical thoroughness. The emails were bad. Not all of them were about Caldwell. There were years of mundane professional correspondence in there, meeting confirmations and vendor negotiations, and the ordinary paper trail of a man who spent his days managing compliance for a large construction company. But interspersed through the ordinary were others. 14 months ago, an email from Whitmore to the lead structural engineer on the Caldwell project, instructing him to revise the column load figures to align with the compliance threshold. The current presentation creates unnecessary friction with the submission timeline. 8 months ago, an email to the inspection team lead telling him to de-emphasize findings from a routine site check because the optics of the current report don't serve the project at this stage. And then, from 7 months ago, an email that made Evelyn set down her coffee and read it 3 times before forwarding it to Philip Chandra. It was from Whitmore to a senior project director named Helen Farr. The subject line was Caldwell, Q3 Safety Briefing. The body of the email read, in its entirety, per our discussion, I've briefed Vanessa's team on the high-level compliance status. Full technical details held back per protocol. She's signed off on the Q3 milestone. We're clear to proceed. Per our discussion. The phrase did a lot of work in 4 words. Full technical details held back per protocol. There was no protocol. Evelyn had verified that within 20 minutes. There was no standing policy at Ashford Capital Group that required the CEO to be shielded from the technical details of a major safety compliance review. It wasn't a protocol. It was a choice. The question, the critical, legally loaded question, was whose choice it was. Whitmore's? Farr's? Vanessa's own? Helen Farr had been with Ashford Capital for 4 years. She was 47, had a background in project management and construction law, and had the particular quality, Mason would later learn from Evelyn's descriptions, of someone who was very good at being in the room when decisions were made and very good at being somewhere else when those decisions were documented. She resigned on Wednesday morning. No statement, no explanation, left a brief email to Raymond Oakes saying she was stepping down for personal reasons and would arrange the transition of her files through her attorney. Her resignation lasted about 6 hours before the federal retention order came through, requiring her to remain available for questioning and to make no alterations or deletions to any company records. Raymond Oakes delivered that news personally. He drove to her house. She answered the door in a bathrobe that suggested she hadn't slept, and he handed her the paperwork, and she read it, and when she was done reading it, she said very quietly, "I want it on record that I told Carl this would happen." "That's something you should be telling investigators," Raymond said. "I know," she said. "I know." On Thursday, the story changed. Evelyn's team, cross-referencing Whitmore's email archive with calendar records pulled from the company's internal scheduling system, found a meeting entry that nobody had produced voluntarily. 14 months ago. A Thursday afternoon, 90 minutes long. Attendees Carl Whitmore, Helen Farr, and Vanessa Ashford. Subject, Caldwell. Compliance Strategy Q4. The calendar entry existed. The meeting had happened. There were no minutes, no official record of what was discussed. But it had happened in the conference room on the 33rd floor, 3 weeks before Maria Solis filed her internal concern report. and 3 weeks before Carl Whitmore marked that concern as closed without a documented resolution. Evelyn called Mason on Thursday evening. "There's a meeting in the calendar," she said. Mason was at the kitchen table. Lily was doing homework across from him. He got up and took the phone to the back porch. "Vanessa was in it," he said. It wasn't a question. "With Whitmore and Farr, 3 weeks before the concern report was killed." He stood on the porch in the cool evening air. "Does it prove she knew?" "It puts her in the room," Evelyn said. "That's not the same as proof, but it gives investigators a foundation to push on. If any of the three of them talked about what was in that compliance review, if the conversation touched on the structural concerns at all, then the claim that she had no knowledge becomes very difficult to sustain. She's going to say they didn't discuss it. Probably. And Whitmore? Whitmore's lawyer has been very quiet, Evelyn said, which usually means they're deciding whether to talk. Mason leaned against the porch railing. It creaked under his weight in a way it had been creaking for 2 years. He'd been meaning to fix it. "What does Whitmore get if he cooperates?" he asked. "That's not something I'm involved in," Evelyn said carefully. "But cooperation in cases like this tends to be incentivized. And if he talks about that meeting, then the picture gets a lot clearer," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Mason," Evelyn said, "I want to make sure you're prepared for the next few days. There are going to be things in the press about you, about your background, about your previous work. Harmon, Velde has started, quietly, but we're aware of it, pushing some information to media contacts suggesting that your original filing was motivated by personal financial interest, that you approached Ashford Capital first as a kind of shakedown and only went to federal channels after they refused." He felt something tighten in his chest. Not panic. Something harder than that. "That's not what happened." "I know that. The disclosure timeline makes it very clear, but they're going to push it anyway, because it's the only narrative that makes you look like something other than what you are." "And what am I?" "A man who did the right thing when it would have been very easy not to," she said, "which is apparently threatening enough that they need to spend money making you look like something else." He went back inside after the call. Lily looked up from her homework. "Bad news?" she said. "No, just news." He sat down. "How's the homework?" "Brutal. We're doing the French Revolution." "What about it?" She looked at her textbook. "Why powerful people always think they're going to stay powerful, I guess." Mason looked at his daughter. "They usually believe it right up until they don't." "Yeah," Lily said. "That's kind of what the book says, too." The media piece ran on Friday. It was a short item attributed to sources familiar with the matter, in a business news outlet that had solid readership in the investment community. It described Mason Brooks as a former federal investigator who left under unclear circumstances, and noted that he had arrived at Ashford Capital Group's headquarters without appointment, carrying unverified documents, seeking a meeting with the company's CEO. It described his disclosure as a matter under review by federal authorities, with questions remaining about the original motivations of the filing. It didn't use the word shakedown. It didn't need to. The implication was constructed carefully enough that it didn't require the word. Patrick Shen called Mason within an hour of the piece going up. "Don't respond," he said. "Don't comment. Don't let anyone who knows you comment on your behalf." "Why not?" "Because the piece isn't about persuading people who know the facts. It's about muddying the water enough that the story becomes disputed. If you respond, you're validating the premise. Let it sit." "It's going to spread," Mason said. "Some of it will. Less than you think. The actual record, the disclosure timeline, the federal case, is publicly visible to anyone who wants to look. Reporters who are doing real work on this story are already looking at the record. The ones running this piece aren't interested in the record." Mason sat with it. It was hard. He wasn't going to pretend it wasn't hard, even to himself. There was something particular about having your integrity attacked in print, something that didn't get easier just because you knew you were right. His ex-colleague had seen the piece and called to say he was furious on Mason's behalf. Gerald Fitch had called, confused and upset, asking if this was going to hurt things. Lily hadn't seen it yet, as far as he knew, and he was hoping to keep it that way for at least another day. He didn't respond publicly. He sat with it and let it be hard and didn't do anything about it. Then, on Saturday morning, the situation changed again. Evelyn called at 7:45 before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. "The forensic team found the recordings," she said. He set the cup down. "What recordings?" Ashford Capital had a standard executive meeting recording protocol for a period of about 2 years. It was discontinued 18 months ago, apparently over privacy concerns, but the archived recordings were still on the company server. A pause. "There's one from 14 months ago." "The compliance strategy meeting," Mason said. "Yes." He waited. "Mason," she said, and her voice had changed. Not dramatically. Evelyn Ross didn't do dramatic, but enough that he noticed. "I've listened to it. The first 20 minutes are routine. Project status updates, financing timeline, nothing that isn't in the official record. And then? And then Helen Farr mentions the structural assessment concerns directly. She uses the phrase load-bearing risk exposure, and she asks Whitmore to give the room a status update on the compliance picture. Mason's hand was tight around the phone. "Whitmore gives a summary," Evelyn continued. "He describes the assessments as within manageable parameters, but says there are presentation issues with some of the figures that need to be cleaned up before submission." "And Vanessa?" A pause that lasted 2 full seconds. She says, and this is a direct quote from the recording, "I don't need the specifics. I need to know if we're clear to hit the Q4 milestone." And Whitmore says yes. And she says, "Then handle it and don't bring me the details." The kitchen was absolutely silent. "Don't bring me the details," Mason repeated. That's what she said. He sat with it. He understood exactly what it meant. Had worked enough cases to understand the precise legal weight of a CEO telling her compliance director not to bring her the details of a safety review with known presentation issues. It wasn't an instruction to commit fraud, but it wasn't nothing. It was the specific kind of nothing that people with power used to keep the responsibility of difficult decisions somewhere below their level, to stay clean while the dirty work happened underneath them. It was the thing that Evelyn had been looking for. Not proof of direct knowledge, something almost worse, proof of deliberate ignorance. Proof that she had specifically chosen not to know. "Does the federal team have the recording?" he asked. "They've had it since this morning," Evelyn said. "It's already in the case file." He exhaled slowly. "Vanessa Ashford's lawyers," Evelyn said, "are being notified of its existence as we speak." What happened inside the Ashford Capital Group boardroom in the 72 hours after the recording was discovered was something Mason would only learn about in fragments, much later, from Evelyn's summaries, from what eventually became part of the public record, from a long conversation he eventually had with Raymond Oakes over coffee in a diner near the federal courthouse, 8 months after everything was over. But the shape of it was this. Raymond Oakes had requested an emergency board meeting on Saturday morning, citing material new evidence in the federal investigation. The board of Ashford Capital Group consisted of 9 members, 6 of whom were independent directors, people with their own reputations and their own legal exposure to consider. Raymond had briefed them individually before the meeting, which was a thing that a general counsel only did when he believed the full group meeting was going to be difficult enough that individual preparation was necessary. Vanessa had walked into that boardroom knowing roughly what was coming. Her own lawyers had told her about the recording. She'd listened to their advice for 3 hours on Friday night in a conference room at Harmon Velde's offices, and the advice had been consistent. Manage the narrative, control what could be controlled, do not make unilateral decisions without counsel present. What she had not expected was Raymond Oakes, who had worked for her for 6 years. Raymond, who had defended the company's interests in 14 different regulatory proceedings during that time. Raymond, who had always been, if not her ally exactly, at least the kind of professional who understood that his job was to protect the institution and its leadership. Raymond sat across the boardroom table from her and said, in the quiet voice of a man who had made peace with a very difficult decision, "Vanessa, I've served this company faithfully for 6 years, and I intend to keep doing so. But serving this company now means I have to tell you something that I believe you do not want to hear, and I need you to listen." She listened. "The recording is going to define the federal investigation from this point forward," he said. "Not because it proves you ordered anything. It doesn't. But because it demonstrates that you were in a position to prevent what happened and you chose not to be informed. In a regulatory framework, that choice has consequences that are not recoverable through legal strategy." "My lawyers disagree," she said. "Your lawyers are very good at winning cases," Raymond said. They are less good at understanding what this particular case is going to look like to a jury, to a regulatory board, to the investors who are already gone, and to the 5,000 workers who are going to occupy that building. He folded his hands on the table. This is not a case that should go to a jury. What are you recommending? I'm recommending that this board take immediate action to demonstrate that the institution's response to this situation is not being driven by the interests of any single executive. I'm recommending an independent safety authority, full cooperation with federal investigators, reinstatement of every employee who raised concerns internally, and Vanessa, a public acknowledgement from you, personal, specific, not managed. The room was very quiet. And if I refuse, she said. Raymond was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same, steady, without heat. Then I believe this board will make those decisions without you. She looked at the board members around the table, 6 independent directors. Their faces told her what she needed to know before any of them said a word. She thought about the lobby, about the balcony, about the man in the green jacket who had stood there with his hands cuffed behind him and looked up at her with an expression that wasn't angry, wasn't afraid, and that she hadn't been able to quite stop thinking about for 2 weeks. She thought about the number 38 million and the one-paragraph response it had received. She thought about the recording of her own voice. Don't bring me the details. She had said it without thinking. That was the worst part, the most honest part. She hadn't been plotting or scheming in that moment. She'd been busy and impatient and certain that the details would sort themselves out, because they always sorted themselves out, because that was what she paid people like Carl Whitmore for. She had been 30 years old and worth $1 billion and completely sure of herself, and she had waved away the details of a structural safety review because details were for other people. The arrogance of it hit her differently now than it had when the words came out of her mouth. 9 people looking at her, and the federal case expanding daily, and the recording existing on a server somewhere. It felt like a different thing entirely than it had on that afternoon 14 months ago, when it had felt like nothing at all. She thought about the workers who had been sent home from the site, about the number 5,000 people who had been going to live and work in a building whose support columns had been quietly, carefully, knowingly misrepresented in a compliance filing. She had not wanted to know. She had said so, out loud, on a recording. And because she had not wanted to know, Carl Whitmore had made the decision he'd been maneuvered into position to make. And now he was likely to spend years in a federal courtroom, and Helen Farr had left in a bathrobe and was talking to investigators. And Maria Solis had come forward with a USB drive she'd kept in a desk drawer for 14 months because she was afraid. And Derek Park had taken screenshots in the middle of the night because he didn't know what else to do. All of that had started with 2 sentences. One from Whitmore about presentation issues. One from her about not needing the details. All right, Vanessa said. She said it to the room, but she was looking at Raymond. All right, she said again. Tell me what cooperation looks like. The board meeting lasted 4 more hours. Mason didn't know any of this was happening. He was cutting the grass in the backyard, finally, in the Saturday afternoon light, while Lily sat on the back porch and did homework, and occasionally threw pieces of cracker to the sparrow that had started appearing on the fence every couple of days. His phone was inside. He'd left it there on purpose. The grass needed cutting, and the porch railing needed fixing, and Lily was going to need new shoes before the school year got much further, and the linoleum in the kitchen was still peeling at the corner. He pushed the lawnmower in straight lines and felt the sun on the back of his neck and thought about nothing much in particular. He'd done what he could do. The rest was the rest. Inside, his phone lit up with a call from Evelyn that he didn't answer. Then a text. Call me when you can. Things are moving. He'd see it in an hour when he went back in for water. He'd call her back and she'd tell him about the board meeting and the board's decision and what was going to happen next. But right now the grass needed cutting, and that was the thing directly in front of him. And Mason Brooks had always believed that the right thing to do was the thing directly in front of you. He kept pushing the mower. The sparrow watched from the fence, unimpressed, then flew away. Evelyn's text was still on the screen when Mason came back inside, grass-stained and sweating, and poured himself a glass of water from the tap. He read it standing at the sink. Call me when you can. Things are moving. He called her back while he was still drinking the water. She picked up on the first ring. The board suspended her, Evelyn said. Without preamble, without warm-up. Just the fact. Delivered the way Evelyn delivered everything. direct and without decoration. Mason set the glass down on the counter. "When?" he said. "This afternoon, emergency session. They voted 6-3 to suspend Vanessa Ashford from all executive duties pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Raymond Oakes has been appointed interim executive director with a mandate to cooperate fully with investigators and implement whatever structural remedies the board determines are necessary." He stood at the sink for a moment, not saying anything. "Mason? I'm here." He looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. He could see the lines in the grass from the mower, straight and even. "What happens to her now?" "Her legal situation is developing," Evelyn said carefully. "The recording puts her in complicated territory. She's not named in the criminal referrals, which are currently focused on Whitmore and potentially Farr, but she's a subject of the investigation, which is a different thing than a target, but not nothing." "And Whitmore?" "His lawyer called the federal prosecutor's office Friday afternoon." Evelyn paused. "He's talking." Mason exhaled through his nose. Not satisfaction exactly. Something more complicated. The feeling of a door opening onto a room you weren't sure you wanted to walk into. "How much does he know?" Mason asked. "We're still finding out, but he was the senior compliance director for 9 years. He knows the infrastructure of how decisions got made and how information got managed across the entire company." She paused. "He's not just talking about Caldwell." Mason thought about that. 9 years, multiple projects. The specific horror of a man who had done this kind of thing long enough that it had become ordinary to him. Not malicious, maybe, in the beginning. Just expedient. Just the way the numbers got handled so the timeline stayed clean. Until it was normal. Until it was just what you did. "Where does the physical inspection stand?" he asked. "Dr. Voss's team completed their preliminary assessment this afternoon. She called me at 5. Evelyn's voice changed, just slightly, just around the edges. "It's worse than the document suggested." He gripped the counter's edge. "The 4 columns that Fitch flagged are the obvious ones," Evelyn said. "But in the course of the full physical review, Voss's team identified 2 additional structural concerns that weren't in any of the documents we'd seen, original or altered. Problems that developed during construction as a result of proceeding on the fraudulent specifications. Secondary issues caused by building on top of a compromised foundation." "How bad?" Mason asked. The pause before she answered told him something. "Andrea Voss does not use the phrase imminent collapse risk lightly," Evelyn said. "She used it in her preliminary report." He stood very still at the counter. "If that building had reached full workforce occupancy on schedule," Evelyn said, "under full load conditions, with 2,000 workers on site, she believes there was a meaningful probability of progressive structural failure. Not certain, not inevitable, but real. And if it had happened, people would have died," Mason said. Yes. He had known this, abstractly, from the beginning. Known it the way you knew a thing, when you read the numbers and understood what they meant. But hearing it stated plainly, imminent collapse risk, full workforce occupancy, people would have died, landed differently than the numbers did. It made a sound in him that he didn't have a word for and that he was going to carry for a long time. "Gerald needs to know this," he said. "I'll call him," Evelyn said. "No, let me do it." He called Fitch that night, after dinner, after Lily had gone to her room. He went to the back porch, which was becoming his place for difficult calls, and he sat on the step and told the old man what Dr. Voss had found. Fitch was quiet for a long time. "I knew," Fitch said finally. His voice was rough in the way it got when he was holding something in. "I knew it was bad. I didn't know if I was right, you know? 43 years, and sometimes you still wonder if you're reading it right." "You were reading it right," Mason said. "How many people?" Fitch started, then stopped. "If it had—" "It didn't," Mason said. "That's the thing to hold on to. It didn't." "Because of you." "Because of you," Mason said. "You're the one who kept those photographs for 16 months. You're the one who trusted me with them when you didn't know me. None of the rest of it happens without that." Fitch made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. "Old welder keeps some pictures on a broken phone," he said. "Hell of a thing." "Hell of a thing," Mason agreed. They sat on the phone together for another few minutes without saying much. Sometimes that was the right kind of conversation. The public announcement came Sunday morning, a press release from Ashford Capital Group, presumably drafted by Raymond Oakes, with significant input from outside counsel, announcing the suspension of Vanessa Ashford, the halt of all construction activity at Caldwell pending independent engineering review, the reinstatement with full back pay of every employee who had raised internal safety concerns, and the engagement of a federal compliance monitor to oversee the company's operations going forward. The press release was careful and professionally worded and contained exactly one sentence that had the fingerprint of Raymond Oakes rather than a communications department. The board acknowledges that the concerns raised by external disclosure were legitimate and should have been addressed far earlier through the company's own internal processes. Not an apology, not quite, but an acknowledgement, which was, in the corporate world, a thing that people spent enormous amounts of money and effort avoiding. The public reaction was immediate and not entirely predictable. The video, the 43-second lobby video, was at 9 million views by Sunday evening. The comment section had, by some organic process that Mason didn't fully understand and didn't particularly want to investigate, become a kind of documentation project. People sharing the press release, screenshotting the board announcement, posting links to the federal oversight case file. There were people in those comments who had worked in construction and who were talking to each other in the specific language of people who had spent careers trying to raise concerns in places that didn't want to hear them. There were people who said nothing except the name of the city or state they were watching from. There were a lot of those. Lily found the comment section on Sunday afternoon. She showed her father. "There's someone here from Montana," she said. "He says he got fired from a pipeline project in 2018 for filing a safety report. And someone from Ohio, she's a nurse, says she got pushed out for reporting medication errors." She scrolled. "Dad, there's like thousands of these." "I know," Mason said. "They're all saying the same kind of thing happened to them." "I know." She looked at him over the phone. "Does that make you feel better or worse?" He thought about it honestly. "Both," he said. "Better that people are talking. Worse that there's so much to talk about." She handed the phone back and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. And when she came back, she sat down on the couch next to him. Not something she did often. She was 13 and too old for that most of the time, or she believed she was. And she said, "Mom would have liked this part, not the bad part, the part where people are talking." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "she would have." They sat there for a while. The TV was off. It was one of those Sunday afternoons that was quiet in the way that felt earned rather than empty. The week that followed was the hardest one since it had all started. Not because things got worse, because the structure of the thing, the shape of the investigation, the public attention, the legal machinery, expanded to a point where Mason's role in it was less clear, less defined, less something he could navigate with the tools he had. He'd known how to file the disclosure. He'd known how to refuse the settlement. He'd known how to sit still and let the process work. But now the process was working in rooms he didn't have access to, involving people he'd never meet, and the waiting was a different kind of hard than the acting. Carl Whitmore's cooperation with federal prosecutors became known publicly on Tuesday through a brief court filing that the reporters covering the case picked up immediately. The filing confirmed that Whitmore had entered into a formal cooperation agreement and was providing testimony in exchange for consideration in his own sentencing. It didn't say what he was saying. It didn't need to. Helen Farr's attorney issued a statement the same day indicating that his client was also cooperating with the investigation. The statement was 6 sentences long and said nothing specific about anything, but its existence was itself information. Both of the people with the most direct knowledge of what had happened inside the compliance process were now talking to federal investigators. Mason read the filing in the parking lot of a grocery store. He'd gone out to get groceries because the refrigerator was nearly empty and life required groceries regardless of what was happening in federal court filings. He read it sitting in the truck. Then he went inside and bought eggs and bread and the specific cereal Lily would only eat if it was a certain brand that cost almost twice as much as the other cereals, and he came home and put things away and made coffee. Patrick Shen called that afternoon. "You've seen the Whitmore filing," Patrick said. "Yes." "How are you doing?" "Fine. A little strange. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing right now." "Nothing," Patrick said. "You're supposed to be doing nothing. The machine is running. Your job was to start it. You did that." Doesn't feel like enough, Mason said. It never does, Patrick said. That's because you're the kind of person who thinks in terms of outcomes rather than actions. But you can't control the outcomes from here. What you controlled, you controlled. The rest is the justice system doing what it does, at the speed it does it, which is going to be slower than you want and messier than you'd like, but it's going to happen. Mason was quiet for a moment. What's your read on Vanessa, legally? Patrick thought about it. She's in the difficult middle, he said. The recording is damaging, but it's ambiguous. Don't bring me the details is not the same as falsify the reports. Her defense will argue she trusted her compliance team to handle the technical details, which is not inherently unreasonable. Executives delegate. The question is whether, at the point when she said it, she had enough information to understand what she was delegating to them. The meeting, Mason said, the one in the calendar. Whitmore presented the compliance status. Right. And if Whitmore testifies that he communicated the nature of the problem clearly enough in that meeting that she would have understood what cleaning up the figures actually meant, that changes things. And if he doesn't? If he doesn't, or if the recording is the best evidence and that's where it stays, then she's probably looking at regulatory penalties rather than criminal exposure. Significant ones. Career-ending ones. But a different category than what Whitmore is facing. She should have listened, Mason said. Not angrily, just a statement. Yes, Patrick said. She should have. The physical inspection of the Caldwell site took 11 days. Dr. Voss's team worked with a federal engineering review unit and 2 independent structural engineers retained by the board's liability insurers, who had their own very urgent reasons for wanting to know exactly what was in that building. They went through it floor by floor, column by column, with equipment and methodology that would have taken a single investigator months to replicate. The final report was 412 pages. Mason didn't read all of it. Evelyn sent him a 30-page summary with the key findings highlighted in the professional blue of someone who highlighted things with the particular emphasis of someone who'd been in this work for 30 years and knew which numbers mattered. The key finding was this. The 4 original columns Fitch had identified were compromised in the way the original documents suggested. The 2 additional concerns that Voss had flagged in her preliminary assessment were confirmed and detailed extensively. And there was a 7th finding, identified during the final inspection phase, that nobody had been looking for, and that turned out to be a consequence of everything else. A connection point between the 2nd and 3rd floor structural plates that had been installed incorrectly, built to tolerances derived from the falsified figures, in a way that under certain load conditions would have created a cascading failure scenario that the report described as potentially catastrophic in consequence. 7 problems. Some they'd known about, some they hadn't. All of them hidden behind numbers that had been changed on a Tuesday night by a man working alone in an office with a company workstation. And what must have been, Mason thought when he read about it, the particular combination of rationalization and fear that made people do things they would never admit to doing. The report recommended complete structural remediation of the compromised elements before any construction could resume. The cost estimate was somewhere between $40 and $60 million. The timeline was 8 to 14 months. The Caldwell Tower project, as originally conceived, on its original timeline, was over. On the Thursday of that week, Vanessa Ashford gave a statement. Not a press release, not something drafted by Harmon, Velde, and polished by a communications team. She gave it in the lobby of the federal courthouse at 9 in the morning before a scheduled meeting with investigators that her own lawyers had arranged as part of what was now a formal voluntary cooperation framework. Mason didn't watch it live. He found out about it from Lily, who was homesick that day. A genuine sick, the mild kind, fever, and a sore throat that wasn't bad enough for a doctor, but bad enough that he'd kept her home, and who had been watching the news on her laptop. "She's talking," Lily said from the couch when Mason came out of the kitchen. He stopped. On the laptop screen, Vanessa Ashford stood in front of a cluster of microphones outside a courthouse entrance. She was wearing a dark coat, no blazer. Her hair was down, which it had never been in any of the photographs Mason had seen of her. She looked smaller than she had on the balcony, though he understood that was partly just the camera angle, and partly the absence of a room full of people whose deference she could count on. He stood in the doorway and listened. "I want to be direct," she was saying. Her voice was steady. Not the manufactured steadiness of someone reading from a script, but the effortful steadiness of someone who had made a decision to hold themselves together in public because the alternative was worse. I have been meeting with federal investigators, and I will continue to do so fully and without condition. What happened at the Caldwell Project was a failure of leadership at every level, including mine, especially mine. She paused. Someone off camera said something Mason couldn't hear. I have been asked whether I knew about the structural concerns, she continued. The honest answer is that I was in a position to know, and I chose not to put myself in that position. I chose not to hear the full details of a safety review because I didn't want those details to complicate a timeline I was committed to. I made that choice. I own it. Another pause. There are workers who were sent away from that site. There are employees who tried to raise concerns inside my company and were silenced, not violently, not cruelly, but in the way that institutions silence people when the people in charge are more interested in protecting the institution than listening to the truth. Those employees are being reinstated. That is the board's commitment and my commitment. She looked directly at the cameras. I misjudged a man who came to my office carrying evidence of a real problem, she said. I judged him by what he was wearing and where he worked and whether he looked like the kind of person I was accustomed to taking seriously. That judgment was wrong. It was arrogant. It was the kind of mistake that I'm going to have to live with for a very long time. She stepped back from the microphones. Her lawyer moved in. The moment was over. Lily muted the laptop. She looked at her dad standing in the doorway. He hadn't moved since she'd called him out. Did she mean it? Lily asked. He thought about it carefully. Some of it, he said. Maybe most of it. I don't know her well enough to say which parts. Does it matter? Whether she means it? He came into the room and sat in the chair across from the couch. For her personally, it matters a lot. For the investigation, for the workers, for the building, not very much. The facts are the facts regardless of what she feels about them. That seems harsh, Lily said. Maybe. He looked at the muted screen where a news anchor was now talking in front of a graphic showing the Caldwell site. She did the wrong thing for a long time. She might be genuinely sorry. People can be genuinely sorry and still face what they did. That's not harsh. That's just how it works. Lily thought about that. Then she pulled her blanket up around her shoulders and said, Can you make me soup? Yeah, he said. I can make you soup. The criminal charges were filed the following Tuesday. 3 counts against Carl Whitmore. Falsification of federal safety records, conspiracy to defraud a federal regulatory body, and 1 additional count related to obstruction, specifically the suppression of Maria Solis's internal concern report. Potential sentencing on the primary counts ranged from 3 to 7 years, though the cooperation agreement would almost certainly affect the final number. Helen Farr faced 2 counts as a co-conspirator, specifically related to her role in routing the falsified documents through the submission process, and her knowledge of Whitmore's instructions to the inspection team. Her cooperation status was factoring into the charge structure in ways that weren't yet fully clear from the public filings. Vanessa Ashford was not charged criminally. The federal prosecutor's statement on the matter was precise. The evidence established executive failure and deliberate avoidance of material information, but not the requisite direct knowledge for criminal liability under the specific statutes at issue. The regulatory penalties applicable to her as a result of the board's findings and the SEC's ongoing review were, the statement noted, substantial and ongoing. Mason read the charging documents in his truck at 6:30 in the morning before Lily was up, with the engine off and a coffee that was already going cold in the cup holder. He read through Whitmore's 3 counts carefully. He thought about the Tuesday night in the office, about a man alone with a workstation and a set of numbers and a decision that would eventually bring 3 federal charges down on him. He didn't feel triumphant about it. He'd worked enough investigations to know that the charging document was just the beginning of another process, that it would be months before any of this reached a resolution, that the outcome was real but never clean in the way that stories about outcomes made them sound. What he felt was more like completion of a circuit, not satisfaction, just the sense that a thing had been started and had reached the point where it was going to carry itself forward. He drank the cold coffee and drove home to make breakfast. Gerald Fitch called that afternoon, having seen the charges on the news. They got him, Fitch said. They charged him, Mason said. It's not the same as got him yet, but it's moving. 3 counts. 3 counts. Fitch was quiet for a moment. You know what I kept thinking about? All those months I had those pictures on my phone and didn't know what to do with them? What? I kept thinking about a building I worked on in 1987, Fitch said. Bridge up in the northern part of the state. I found a problem, and I reported it, and my foreman at the time listened, and we fixed it. Just fixed it. Normal. That's how it's supposed to work. His voice shifted slightly. Shouldn't be hard. No, Mason said. It shouldn't. But here we are. Here we are, Mason agreed. They were quiet together for a moment on the phone, the way they'd gotten comfortable being quiet together over the months since this started. Gerald, Mason said, have you talked to a lawyer about your protected status and the financial side of the disclosure? The whistleblower thing? Yeah. Evelyn called me about it, Fitch said. I don't entirely understand it. She said something about a federal provision. It means you might be entitled to a portion of any financial penalties that come out of the federal case, Mason said. You should let someone explain it to you properly. Patrick Shen. I'll give you his number. He's straight. I don't need money, Mason. You might not need it, Mason said, but you earned it. Those are different things. Fitch made a sound that was somewhere between reluctant and considering. Call him, Mason said. Just talk to him. The board's announcement of the Independent Worker Safety Authority came 2 weeks later on a Wednesday morning. Mason found out about it from Evelyn, who called him before the public release went out because she thought he deserved to know before he read it somewhere. The Independent Caldwell Safety Authority, the name would eventually be broadened to cover all Ashford capital projects, was being established with a permanent mandate, independent funding through a court-supervised escrow account, and the authority to issue binding halt orders on any construction project in the company's portfolio. It could not be dissolved by executive action. It reported directly to the federal regulatory body and to the board, bypassing the executive chain entirely. And it needed a director. Evelyn told him that part last. They want you to lead it, she said. I was standing in the backyard when she told him. The grass was cut. He'd finally fixed the porch railing the previous weekend, though the repair was a little uneven and probably needed another look. The raised garden beds were still not built. That was still on the list. Me, he said. You have the background, the credibility, and the public trust, Evelyn said. More importantly, you have the specific kind of credibility with ordinary workers that no institutional candidate would have. The board is very aware that the new authority needs to be something that workers on the ground actually believe will listen to them. He thought about this for a long time. Evelyn let him think. If I take it, he said, I want structural conditions. What kind? The director's position has a term limit, 4 years, renewable once. No director serves more than 8 years. After that, they're out and someone new comes in, specifically to prevent the kind of insularity that leads to a director becoming as disconnected from the work as the people they're supposed to oversee. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. That's a condition that limits your own power. That's the point, Mason said. What else? Mandatory site visits. The director spends at least 30% of their time on active project sites, not in an office, with workers, not with managers. And the safety reporting line goes directly to the authority, not through any company management layer first. Anyone at any level can report directly, anonymously if they choose, and the report triggers an automatic review that can't be closed without documented resolution. He was describing almost exactly the things that had failed at Ashford Capital, the things that had allowed Whitmore to mark Maria Solis's report closed, the things that had allowed Fitch to go 16 months with photographs on a broken phone because no clear path existed for getting them somewhere they'd be heard. I'll present these to the board, Evelyn said. They're not negotiable, Mason said. If they want me, these are the conditions. I'll tell them that. And Ev, the whistleblower protections. For every employee in the company, not just Caldwell. Full legal protection for anyone who files a safety report. With an independent legal fund the authority administers if any employee faces retaliation. Company funded but authority controlled. That one's going to be expensive, she said. I know, he said. They have 800 million reasons to afford it. The board accepted all the conditions within 48 hours. The vote was unanimous. Mason sat with the acceptance email for a long time before he told Lily. He wasn't sure how to tell her. Not because he thought she'd object. she wouldn't, but because accepting the position felt like the beginning of something. And he'd learned in the past 3 years to be careful about beginnings. They had weight. They had consequences that stretched further than you could see from where you were standing. He told her at dinner. He explained what the authority was, what the job was, what he'd negotiated. She listened. She ate her pasta. He'd made pasta again, the same pasta as the night after the lobby, and he hadn't done that intentionally, but there was something that felt right about it. When he finished explaining, she said, "Are you going to take it?" "I took it," he said, "this afternoon." She looked at her plate for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to have to wear a suit?" He almost laughed. "Probably sometimes, yeah." "What about the jacket?" "The jacket goes everywhere I go," he said. "That's not changing." She nodded, apparently satisfied with this. She twirled pasta onto her fork. "Is it going to be dangerous, like legally? More people trying to shut you up?" "Probably," he said. "Different people, different ways. That's just the nature of the work." "But you're doing it anyway." "Yeah." She thought for a moment. "Mom would have been annoyed at you," she said, "for taking a job that's going to be stressful and complicated when you could have just gone back to logistics and had normal evenings." "Probably," Mason said, "but she also would have understood why you took it." "Yeah," he said, "I think she would have." Lily twirled more pasta. "I understand why you took it." He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, 13 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and something that was entirely her own, a kind of clear-eyed practicality about the world that Mason found, on most days, more grounding than anything else in his life. "Thank you," he said. "I'm still going to need those garden beds," she said, "before winter." "I know," he said. "I haven't forgotten." "You've been saying that for 4 months." "I know." He picked up his fork. "This weekend. I mean it this time." She gave him a look that suggested she'd believe it when she saw it, which was, he reflected, entirely fair. Outside, the evening was settling in. The city was doing what cities do, moving, humming, building things, tearing things down, full of people who were trying to get it right, and people who were cutting corners and people who were somewhere in between, which was most people, most of the time. The Caldwell site sat quiet behind its fencing, with the inspection team's markings still on the columns, and Dr. Voss's report sitting in a federal file that would eventually lead to a remediation and a rebuilt foundation, and one day, a building that was actually what it claimed to be. Carl Whitmore would be arraigned in 3 weeks. Helen Farr, 2 weeks after that. The legal process would take as long as it took, which was going to be a while. Vanessa Ashford had begun the process of liquidating a significant portion of her personal assets to address the regulatory penalties. She'd given one interview to a business publication that was notable mainly for being very short and for the absence of any language that sounded managed or coached. She said near the end of it that the most important thing she had learned was that the size of the problem in front of you has nothing to do with the size of the person pointing it out. She said it without apparent awareness that it was going to be the sentence everyone quoted afterward. Gerald Fitch had spoken with Patrick Shen and was going to receive, under the federal whistleblower provision, a financial settlement that would change the last years of his life in ways that he was still getting used to the idea of. The first thing he told Patrick he wanted to do with it was get a new phone, because the flip phone with the cracked screen had finally stopped working the previous week. Patrick had said that seemed like a reasonable place to start. Maria Solis had been reinstated to her position with 18 months of back pay and a formal written acknowledgement from the board that her internal concern report had been legitimate and should never have been suppressed. She'd read the letter twice, then filed it in a drawer, and then gone back to her desk and started doing her job. She'd told someone afterward that it felt both better and smaller than she'd expected it to. Most things did. Derek Park had also been reinstated. He was 28, and this had been his first real job out of school, and he'd been terrified for months that what he'd done was going to follow him for the rest of his career. What followed him instead, in a way he was still adjusting to, was a reputation for having done the right thing when it was hard. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that. He'd figure it out. Mason Brooks would start his new position in 3 weeks. He had a lot to learn about the administrative side of things, which he knew and which didn't particularly worry him. He'd learned things before. He had a backyard that still needed raised garden beds. He had a daughter who needed new shoes. He had a porch railing that was mostly fixed but needed another look. These were the things in front of him, and Mason Brooks had always been a man who did the things in front of him. He finished his pasta and did the dishes and went to look up how to build a raised garden bed because he'd promised Lily this weekend and he meant it this time, and he figured he should know what he was doing before he started. He built the raised garden beds that weekend. It took him most of Saturday and a good portion of Sunday morning. He'd watched 3 different videos on how to do it properly, bought lumber that was slightly more expensive than what the cheapest option would have been, because the cheaper kind had a tendency to warp in wet seasons, and borrowed a drill from his neighbor Carl. Not Carl Whitmore, a different Carl entirely, a retired school teacher who lived 2 houses down and who lent things freely and without the expectation of conversation. Lily supervised. This meant she sat on the porch step with a glass of iced tea and offered opinions at irregular intervals. "That corner is crooked," she said, around 10 on Saturday morning. "I know," Mason said. "I'm fixing it." "It's still crooked." "Lily." "I'm just saying." He fixed the corner. It was still slightly crooked, maybe half a degree off from perfect, but it was solid, and it was level where it mattered, and when he stood back and looked at it, it looked like something a person had built with their hands on a Saturday, which was exactly what it was. By Sunday afternoon, there were 2 raised beds in the backyard, filled with soil he'd driven to the garden center to buy, and Lily had already decided exactly what she wanted to plant in each one, having apparently spent considerable time on this question without telling him. "Tomatoes here," she said, pointing, "and herbs there. Basil, rosemary, maybe mint, but separate because mint takes over everything." "Where did you learn that about mint?" "Mom's garden," she said, simply, without the careful tone she sometimes used when her mother came up. Just the plain fact of it, the way a person references something that is part of them. He looked at the beds, crooked corner and all. "Good," he said. He started the new position on a Monday 3 weeks later, driving to a building that was not the Ashford Capital Group headquarters, but a smaller office 3 miles away. A deliberate choice by the board, separating the authority from the corporate structure physically as well as operationally. The office was functional without being impressive. A conference room, 4 staff desks, a waiting area that would be for people coming in with concerns, and Mason's own office, which he immediately noted was larger than he needed and which he intended to use primarily as a place to keep files. His first hire was a woman named Teresa Van, 49, who had spent 12 years as a construction site safety officer before spending 4 years fighting a wrongful termination suit against a company that had fired her for refusing to sign off on a compromised electrical inspection. She'd won the suit. She'd also burned through most of her savings winning it, which was the kind of thing that shouldn't happen but did, regularly, to people who were right at inconvenient moments. Mason called her directly, not through an HR process. "I heard about you through the Federal Compliance Network," he said when she picked up. "I want to offer you the position of Senior Field Inspector for the authority. You'd report directly to me and you'd spend most of your time on sites, not in an office." There was a pause on the line. "You're Mason Brooks?" she said. "Yes." "The one from the video?" "Yes." Another pause, shorter. "What's the pay?" He told her. It was fair, not extravagant, fair. "Benefits?" "Full, including legal protection coverage, specifically because of what the job asks people to do." She was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why me specifically?" Mason thought about how to answer honestly without sounding like he was performing honesty. "Because you were right and you paid for it anyway," he said. "And because someone who's been through that understands what the people coming into this office are going to be feeling when they walk in. I don't want inspectors who've only ever worked from the position of institutional safety. I want people who know what it costs to report something true in the wrong environment." The line was quiet for a beat. "When do I start?" she said. The work was harder than he'd expected, and he'd expected it to be hard. The administrative architecture of the new authority had to be built almost entirely from scratch. Intake protocols, field inspection schedules, the specific language of the reporting forms that would determine whether someone filing a concern felt heard or felt processed. Mason spent a week on the language of the reporting forms alone, because he knew from his own years of experience that the difference between a form that workers trusted and one they didn't often came down to 3 or 4 words. He visited the Caldwell site in his second week, Not officially, not as part of an inspection. Just drove there in the early morning, parked outside the fencing, and looked at it. The site was quiet. The fencing still had the inspection team's notice boards on it. A few pigeons had set up residence on a partially completed floor somewhere around the 8th level. The unfinished skeleton of the building caught the morning light in a way that was, from a purely visual standpoint, striking. The steel and concrete of a thing that was 40% of what it was supposed to become stopped mid-sentence. He stood there for about 20 minutes with his coffee. He thought about the 5 columns. He thought about the 47 pages Gerald Fitch's photographs had generated and the 412 pages the inspection team had generated after that, and the fact that all of it traced back to one man sitting at a workstation on a Tuesday night making small, specific, deliberate changes to a set of numbers. He thought about what Dr. Voss had said. Imminent collapse risk under full load conditions. 2,000 workers. Potentially. He thought about the word potentially and what it meant, and what it would have meant if things had gone differently. Then he got back in the truck and drove to the office because there was work to do, and standing outside a construction site in the early morning, thinking about what might have been, wasn't the kind of thinking that moved anything forward. Carl Whitmore's trial began 8 months after the original charges were filed. Mason was not called as a witness. The federal case was built on documents and recordings and testimony from people with direct knowledge of the compliance process, and Mason's role as the external filer of the original disclosure didn't put him in the witness chair. He followed the trial the way anyone follows something they started but can't finish, through news reports and calls from Evelyn and the occasional text from Patrick Shen that said things like, Day 4. Whitmore's lawyer is trying to argue that altering figures is standard industry practice. Not going well for that argument. Whitmore testified in his own defense for 2 days. Mason read the transcripts. He came across as a man who had spent so long inside a system that rationalized what it did that he genuinely lost the ability to see clearly what he'd done. Not a monster. Not someone who'd set out to hurt anyone. Someone who had made small compromises until the compromises were no longer small, and who had then made the larger ones because the smaller ones had already redrawn his understanding of what was acceptable. Mason understood that, in a way he didn't talk about much. Not because he excused it, but because he knew that the line between the man who reported and the man who concealed wasn't always a line of character. Sometimes it was a line of circumstance, of who happened to be watching, of whether the cost of truth in that particular moment was something you could afford to pay. Most people never got tested the way Whitmore had been tested. Most people never found out which side of that line they'd land on. He'd been lucky enough to be tested when his back was against the wall anyway, when he'd already lost the thing that would have made the compromise feel worth it. Some nights he thought about that. The jury deliberated for 4 days. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon in early spring. Guilty on all 3 counts. Sentencing was set for 8 weeks later. The cooperation agreement reduced the final sentence. Whitmore received 3 years and 11 months, with 18 months served before eligibility for supervised release. His lawyer indicated he would appeal. The federal prosecutor's office indicated they were confident in the verdict. Helen Farr pleaded guilty to her 2 counts in a separate proceeding, the week before Whitmore's sentencing. She received an 18-month sentence, suspended on condition of continued cooperation and a permanent bar from serving in any compliance, regulatory, or executive capacity in the construction industry. Mason read both outcomes in the morning before Lily was up, with a cup of coffee that for once he'd managed to drink while it was still hot. He sat with the verdicts for a while. He didn't feel what he'd expected to feel, which was, he wasn't sure. Something more complete, maybe. What he actually felt was quieter than that. The sense that a thing had reached its conclusion, and that the conclusion was what it was, and that it was enough. Not perfect, not everything, but enough. He thought about the workers who'd been sent home from the site, and who'd gone back, most of them, once the remediation plan was approved and the independent authority signed off on the new structural specifications. The Caldwell Tower project had been redesigned around correct engineering figures, which meant a different timeline and a different cost structure, and a building that would eventually be what it was supposed to be from the start. Several of the original subcontractors had been replaced in the rebidding process. Several had stayed on. The work was real, and it was progressing, and it was being done now under the kind of oversight that Maria Solis and Derek Park and Gerald Fitch and a lot of other people had never quite managed to get before. He finished his coffee and got up to make breakfast. Evelyn Ross came to see him in May. Not for any official reason. The federal oversight role that had connected them through all of this was moving into a different phase, the ongoing monitoring phase that required less urgency and more patience, but because they were friends, and because they hadn't sat in the same room and talked without something immediate at stake in longer than either of them could remember. She came to the house on a Saturday. Lily made them both coffee, which was impressive given that the coffee was better than what Mason usually managed, and then disappeared to her room with the tact of a teenager who understood that adults sometimes needed to talk without an audience. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Mason had opened the settlement envelope, where Lily had done homework while the video spread, where they'd eaten pasta twice on nights that turned out to matter more than they'd seemed to at the time. "How's the job?" Evelyn asked. "Complicated," he said, "in the way I expected and in ways I didn't." He wrapped his hands around the mug. "The intake volume is higher than I projected. A lot of workers have been waiting for something like this to exist, which is good, but it also means we need more field capacity than I budgeted for in year one. Are you going to have the resources?" "I'm working on it. The court-supervised fund is solid for the first 3 years. After that, it depends on the board's commitment, which is, I'm watching." Evelyn nodded. "You don't fully trust the board." "I trust that they responded correctly to a crisis," he said. "I'll know more about who they are when there's no crisis. That's usually when you find out." She smiled at that. A real smile, the kind that showed some of the 30 years she'd been doing this work and how much of it she'd seen. "You haven't changed," she said. "I'm older," he said. "You're more tired," she said. "Different thing." He drank his coffee. "How are you doing?" Genuinely. She thought about it, which he appreciated. He'd asked the question genuinely, and she was answering it the same way. "Ready for this phase to be slower," she said. "I've been in emergency mode for 8 months. My brain needs a different gear." She paused. "I'm thinking about teaching at the university, the graduate program in federal compliance." "That would be good," he said, and meant it. The kind of knowledge Evelyn carried didn't do the world as much good locked inside one person's career as it did distributed into 100 careers that were just starting. "I'd want you to guest lecture," she said. He made a face. "I'm not a lecturer." "You'd be a terrible lecturer," she agreed. "That's actually why I want you. The students get too many people who know how to present. They need someone who knows how to sit in a truck in a parking lot and wait for things to develop at the speed they actually develop." He almost laughed. Vanessa Ashford had been largely absent from public life since her statement outside the courthouse. The regulatory proceedings against her had concluded in the late fall, a substantial financial penalty, a formal finding of executive failure, and a 5-year bar from serving as a director or officer of any company subject to federal construction safety oversight. The financial penalties, combined with the civil liability that the investment groups had pursued separately, had cost her roughly 60% of the net worth she'd held at the height of the Caldwell project. She was not broke. She was not going to be struggling. But the specific shape of the life she'd built, the company, the position, the forward momentum of a 30-year-old who had turned a billion-dollar operation and was going to turn it into something larger, that was gone. Not temporarily disrupted, actually gone. Mason thought about her occasionally. Not with satisfaction and not with sympathy exactly, but with the specific consideration he gave to things he was still trying to understand. He'd seen the lobby through her eyes once, trying to work out how a person got to that point, how you built yourself into a position where a man in a worn jacket carrying evidence of a real problem looked to you like an inconvenience to be removed. He thought it probably happened slowly, the same way Whitmore's compromises had happened slowly. The same way any large error happened, not in a single moment of decision, but in the accumulated weight of 100 smaller ones, each of which seemed reasonable at the time, until you were standing on a balcony, laughing at a man in handcuffs, and it felt like the obvious thing to do. The difference between Whitmore and Vanessa, ultimately, might have been less about moral character and more about position. She'd had the luxury of not needing to know the details. He hadn't. So he'd carried the details and made decisions about them, and when those decisions unraveled, his name was on them. That wasn't justice, exactly. But it was how it worked. He wondered sometimes what she did with her days now. whether the statement outside the courthouse had been the beginning of something genuine or the end of something managed. He didn't have a way to know. He didn't think about it enough to find out. In June, something happened that Mason hadn't anticipated. He was on site at a commercial project on the east side of the city, not an Ashford Capital project, one of 3 other companies that had, in the months following the Caldwell case, requested that the independent authority extend its oversight to their projects voluntarily, which was a thing that would not have happened before, and which spoke to the specific power of public attention to change what companies found it in their interest to do. He was walking the 3rd floor with Teresa Van, doing a routine review, when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number, but a local area code. He almost didn't answer. He generally didn't answer unknown numbers, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Brooks?" A woman's voice. Careful. The way people were careful when they were saying something they weren't sure they were allowed to say. "Yes," he said. "My name is Sandra Okafor. I'm a structural inspector for Meridian Construction Services. I have a situation. Someone told me to call this number." He stopped walking. Teresa glanced at him and kept going, giving him space the way good colleagues gave space. "Tell me about the situation," he said. It took her 3 minutes to describe it. A mixed-use project in the southern part of the city. Foundation drainage issues that she'd raised twice with her project manager. A concern report she'd filed internally that had been returned to her with a note saying the matter was under review. 2 weeks of review and no documented resolution. A manager who had told her, in a conversation she'd noted but not recorded, that the drainage situation was within acceptable scope for the project phase. She was 26 years old, had been in the industry for 3 years, was not sure she was reading it right, was not sure if this was the kind of thing the authority handled, was not sure if calling was the right move. "You're reading it right," Mason said, "and calling is exactly the right move." A pause. Is this something you'll actually look at? Because I've heard things like this said before, and then, "I'm going to give you the name of our intake coordinator," Mason said. "Her name is Teresa Van. She's going to call you today, not tomorrow, and she's going to walk you through the process step by step. And Sandra, your report is protected from the moment this call ends. You understand that?" "I think so." "You can't be fired for this. You can't be demoted. You can't have your assignments reduced or your performance reviews affected. Any of those things happen, you call us directly and we respond within 24 hours. That's not a promise. It's the law. And it's the structure we've built to enforce it." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. The same word Lily had used once, at a kitchen table. The same weight in it. He gave her Teresa's number. He hung up and stood on the 3rd floor of someone else's construction site for a moment, looking out through the open wall at the city. That was the job. That was what it was. Not the verdicts and the press releases and the board decisions, though those mattered. The job was this: a 26-year-old inspector standing somewhere with a phone in her hand, and a problem she couldn't name quite right yet, and a number to call that hadn't existed 8 months ago. He went to find Teresa. Gerald Fitch got his new phone in the spring. A real smartphone this time, which he had not wanted, but which his granddaughter had insisted on, and which he was grudgingly learning to use. He sent Mason a text in April that read, "This phone is ridiculous. Too many things on it." How are you? And Mason had laughed for the first time in a while when he read it. He texted back, "I'm good. How are the hands?" Fitch's reply, 3 minutes later, still shaking sometimes. "Doctor says that's just age now. Taking pictures with the new phone. It's clearer than the old one." Mason put the phone down and sat with that for a moment. Gerald Fitch, 71 years old, taking pictures with a phone that was clearer than the cracked flip phone he'd carried for 16 months because he didn't know what else to do with what he knew. Taking pictures of whatever he was taking pictures of now. Not evidence, just the world, the ordinary visual record of a man who'd spent his life noticing things. He texted back, "Send me one sometime." 3 days later, a photograph arrived. A bridge in the northern part of the state caught in late afternoon light. An old bridge, steel and concrete, arching over water, taken from below, looking up at the underside of the span. It was a good photograph. The light was doing something real. Mason set it as the background on his phone and didn't tell anyone why. Lily's birthday was in July. She turned 14. Mason took her to dinner at a restaurant she'd chosen, which was a place that served tacos in a building that had been a gas station, and which was, she maintained, the best restaurant she'd ever been to, a claim he was skeptical of but willing to accept. They sat across from each other at a small table and ate tacos and talked about school and about the garden, which had produced exactly one tomato so far, but which Lily considered a success on principle, and about a history project she was working on about labor movements in the early 20th century, which she'd chosen herself and which Mason found quietly amusing given everything. At some point during the meal, she got quiet in the way she sometimes got quiet, and he waited, because Lily's quiet was never empty. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah." "Do you regret it? Any of it?" He looked at her. "Which part?" "The job you lost? The settlement you didn't take? All of it. Because now you have this harder job and less money than you would have had, and people still write bad things about you sometimes." She twisted a piece of tortilla between her fingers. "And I know why you did it. I understand why. But do you ever wish you'd just not?" It was a real question, the kind a 14-year-old asks when she's been sitting with it long enough that it's become more than a 14-year-old question. He thought about it honestly. Not the answer that sounded right, the actual answer. "Sometimes," he said, "not the decision itself. But the cost of it? Yeah, sometimes." He looked at the table. "The job wasn't bad. I was good at it, and it was enough, and I didn't have to think about it all the time. There's something to be said for that." He paused. "And there are days now where the work is so complicated, and I'm so tired, and the machinery moves so slowly that I wonder what it would feel like to just not be responsible for it." Lily was looking at him with her mother's eyes. "But then something like Sandra Okafor calls," he said, "and there's no version of the math where not picking up that phone is better than picking it up." "Who's Sandra Okafor?" "A 26-year-old inspector who found a problem and called us." He picked up his taco. "Her drainage concern turned out to be real, by the way. Site's been halted pending review." Lily thought about this. "So it's already happening again." "It's always already happening," he said. "That's the thing. There's no version of the world where it stops happening. The best you can do is make sure there's somewhere for people to call." She was quiet for a moment. "Mom would say you're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you make peace with something by turning it into work." She said it without judgment, just observation, the way someone describes weather. She always said you process things by finding the task inside them. He sat with that. It was accurate, more accurate than he was entirely comfortable with. "Is that bad?" he asked. Lily shrugged. She didn't think so. She said it was just how you were built. She picked up her own taco. "I think you could maybe also just feel things sometimes, without the task. But that's just me." He looked at his daughter, 14 years old, clearer-eyed than most adults he knew. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said, in the completely matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious fact rather than claiming a victory. He drove them home after dinner. It was a July evening, warm and soft in the way July evenings were, and the city was doing its summer thing, people out on steps, restaurants with tables pushed onto sidewalks. The particular energy of a city that had remembered, in the warmth, that it wanted to be outside. He drove his old truck, the one he'd parked 3 blocks from the Ashford Capitol building on a Thursday morning that now felt both recent and very far away. The check engine light that had been on since February was still on. He'd been meaning to get it looked at. Lily had the window down and her arm out, hand cutting through the air. He thought about the video. 9 million views eventually. It had peaked and plateaued and become the kind of thing people occasionally referenced when they were talking about other things. He'd never watched it in its entirety. He didn't think he ever would. He knew what was in it, and he didn't need to see it from the outside. He thought about the balcony, about the laugh, about standing there with his hands cuffed behind him and making the decision to stay calm, not because calm was easy, but because calm was the only thing that left the next step available. He'd been asked, in the only interview he'd given, a print piece, no video, 8 months after the lobby, what he'd been thinking at that moment. He'd said he'd been thinking about the phone call, about whether Evelyn would pick up, and whether the disclosure package had transmitted cleanly, and whether he'd done enough of the groundwork before walking into that building to make the call count. The interviewer had asked if he'd been thinking about Vanessa Ashford. He'd thought about it for a moment, then he'd said, no, not really. He'd been thinking about Gerald Fitch at home watching the news with the sound too loud. about 5,000 people who were going to go to work in a building eventually, and who deserved for the building to be what it was supposed to be. The interviewer had asked, "What do you want people to take from your story?" He'd thought about that one longer. What he'd said was this. He didn't think of it as his story. It was Fitch's story, a 71-year-old welder who kept photographs on a broken phone for 16 months because he knew what he knew and couldn't unknow it. It was Maria Solis's story, a woman who filed a report and got it buried and kept the USB drive in her desk drawer anyway, just in case, because getting buried once doesn't always mean the truth has to stay buried. It was Derek Park's story, a 28-year-old on his first real job who took screenshots at night because something told him the record needed to exist somewhere. It was those stories. He was the phone call those stories eventually found. The interviewer had asked if there was anything he wanted to say to people watching from positions of power, CEOs, executives, people running things. He'd been quiet for a long moment. What he'd said was, "The person in front of you with the worn jacket and no appointment is not automatically the problem. Sometimes they're the solution to a problem you don't know you have yet. And the cost of not listening, of deciding based on how someone looks rather than what they're carrying, is never paid only by you." He hadn't added anything to that. He'd let it be what it was. They got home. Lily went upstairs to call a friend. Mason sat on the back porch in the July warmth and looked at the raised garden beds, which were doing what they were supposed to do. The tomatoes were coming in slowly, 3 of them now, and the herbs were full and the mint was, as Lily had predicted, showing signs of territorial ambition. His phone sat on the step next to him. The background was Fitch's photograph, the bridge in the northern light, the steel spanning the water, taken from below by an old man with a new phone who'd spent a lifetime noticing when things weren't what they claimed to be. He thought about the question Lily had asked in the restaurant, whether he regretted it. The honest answer, the full one he hadn't quite given her, was more complicated than yes or no. What he felt about it was the same thing he felt about most of the real decisions in his life. About quitting the federal job when Claire got sick, about staying in the neighborhood afterward instead of moving somewhere smaller and cheaper, about keeping Claire's photograph on the wall where Lily could see it every day. Not regret and not peace. Something that moved between the two depending on the day, the weather, the specific weight of the morning. He had made the decision to walk into that building in a green canvas jacket with a frayed cuff and a folder under his arm. He'd made it knowing something of what it might cost him, and not knowing most of it. He'd stood in handcuffs in a lobby while someone laughed from a balcony above him, and he'd made one phone call because one phone call was what the moment required. He had not saved anyone dramatically. He had not done anything that should, by rights, have required courage. He'd filed a document, made a call, refused a check, said no one no was the only answer that meant anything. None of it had been cinematic. All of it had been the slow, ordinary machinery of doing what you knew was right when it would have been genuinely easier not to. The result of that machinery, unspectacular in the doing of it, was this: a building that would eventually be safe, workers who would eventually go home at the end of their shifts, a 26-year-old inspector in the southern part of the city who had a number to call, a 71-year-old welder taking photographs with a clearer phone. That wasn't everything. It wasn't even most of everything that was wrong in the world of poured concrete and load-bearing columns and compliance submissions, and the specific human tendency to make small accommodations until they became large ones. But it was real. It had happened. It could not unhappen. Mason Brooks sat on his back porch in the July warmth, in the same old jacket, not rich and not famous, and not particularly at peace, but not willing to trade any of it for the version of this year where he'd stayed in the truck. The check engine light would need to get looked at this week. The mint was going to need to be contained before it took over the rosemary. He had a meeting Monday morning with a drainage inspector named Sandra Okafor, who had found a problem and called a number that hadn't existed 8 months ago. He was tired. He was behind on 3 things, and probably more that he hadn't looked at yet. The porch railing held, though. He'd fixed it right the second time, and it held. One thing at a time, that was all. That was always all it was. He stayed on the porch until it got dark, listening to the neighborhood settle into its evening, and then he went inside and did the dishes and checked in on Lily and went to bed. Tomorrow was Monday. There was work to do.